In 1981, two people disappeared without a trace in the jungles of the Bolivian Amazon. Their footprints were lost among the vast green labyrinth, becoming one of the many mysteries that the largest rainforest on the planet holds. But this story is not about them. It's the story of those who survived through a veritable hell. The Amazon of the early 1980s represented the last frontier of an uncharted world. 5.5 million square kilometers of pristine jungle, where the crowns of trees weave overhead, creating a perpetual twilight even on the sunniest day. It is a place where every square meter can be a deadly danger, be it a poisonous snake lurking in the fallen leaves or a predator stalking its prey in the dense undergrowth. Humidity here never drops below 80%, making every breath a struggle against the thick, hot air. Temperatures rarely drop below 30 degrees, and tropical downpours hit the land without warning, turning narrow forest trails into impassable torrents of mud. Locals say, "There is no bad or good weather in the Amazon. There is only the jungle, and it spares no one." But in the early 80s, this harsh land was attracting more and more young adventurers. The hippie era was coming to an end, and the new generation craved not spiritual revelations, but real, dangerous adventures. They read books about great explorers, watched movies about lost cities, and dreamed of finding their own path to fame or fortune. For many, the Amazon seemed like just such a place, the last corner on Earth where a great discovery could still be made. That same year, a young Israeli, Yosi was completing his naval service. He was only 21 years old, but he had already had 3 years of military training that had hardened his character and given him confidence in his own abilities. However, it was not the military service that determined his fate. One day, Yosi got a book that changed his life forever. Henri Charrier's autobiography, The Moth, the story of a man who survived in the most unbelievable conditions. This book ignited in the young Israeli an unquenchable thirst for adventure. After saving up money from occasional part-time jobs, Yosi set off on a journey across South America. His journey began in Venezuela, where he hitchhiked, slept in cheap hostels, and ate in roadside eateries. It was there, on those endless roads, that his dream of reaching the heart of the continent, the legendary Amazon, began to take shape. In La Paz, the highest mountain capital of the world, fate brought him together with an unusual company. The first was Marcus Stamm, a Swiss teacher looking for oblivion after breaking up with his girlfriend. A refined European accustomed to comfort, he nevertheless dreamed of real adventure. Then Kevin Gale, an American photographer who dreamed of capturing the untouched nature of the Amazon, joined them. His camera was always at the ready to catch the perfect shot. But the most enigmatic figure in their company was Karl Ruprechter, an Austrian who introduced himself as an experienced geologist. Tall, with a piercing gaze and impeccable manners, he told amazing stories about Indian villages lost in the jungle and gold deposits. His stories sounded like chapters from an adventure novel, and the young travelers listened breathlessly. "I know the place," Karl would say, leaning over a map in the smoky bar of La Paz. "There, deep in the jungle, lives a tribe that has little contact with white men, and they have gold. We just need to get there." His words fell on fertile ground. 4 young men, each with their own dreams and ambitions, were ready to believe in this fairy tale. None of them knew then that this proposal would be the beginning of a story that would change their lives forever. And certainly no one suspected that 2 of them would never return from this journey again. The plan for the expedition seemed simple. Fly to the small town of Rurinabak, and from there move deep into the jungle along the Beni River and its tributaries. Karl assured that he knew the route well, and that the journey would take no more than a week. "The main thing is to get to the village of Takana," he explained, running his finger over a worn map. "And there the local guides will show us the way to the gold." Preparations for the expedition were surprisingly sloppy. Backpacks were stuffed with rice and beans, and some salt and sugar were taken. Carl insisted that they didn't need large supplies. "There's plenty of food in the jungle, you just have to know how to find it." This carelessness should have alerted the travelers, but the excitement of the coming adventure overshadowed the voice of reason. The first days of the voyage resembled an exciting ride. They traveled by motorboat on the wide Beni River, admiring the untouched nature. Kevin was constantly taking pictures. Flocks of colorful parrots flying over the water, bizarre orchids hanging from the trees, ancient trees whose roots slid down to the water like giant snakes. But the farther they traveled deep into the jungle, the more the atmosphere changed. The river narrowed, the current quickened. Tall trees overhung the water, creating a green tunnel through which light barely penetrated. The sounds of the jungle grew louder and more disturbing. Cries of invisible birds rustling in the undergrowth, strange splashes in the dark water. On the 5th day they reached the small village of Asariamas, located at the confluence of the Tuichi and Asariamas rivers. It was the last outpost of civilization before the vast sea of jungle. The natives looked at the strange group of strangers with bewilderment. One old Indian, shaking his head, said something in his own language. Later, an interpreter explained his words. "The rainy season is near. You can't go into the jungle now." But the warning went unheeded. The next morning, leaving behind the last signs of civilization, the 4 travelers went deeper into the forest. None of them suspected that they had crossed an invisible line beyond which the rules of the ordinary world ceased to apply. A challenge awaited them, one that none of them were prepared for. The jungle greeted the travelers with stifling heat and hordes of insects. The air was so humid that their clothes did not have time to dry, becoming a breeding ground for fungus and mold. Every step was difficult as their feet sank into the swollen earth, and sharp vines clung to their clothes, leaving bloody scratches on their skin. After 3 days of travel, it became clear that the food supply was melting away at a catastrophic rate. Rice and beans, which had seemed sufficient in La Paz, were disappearing at an alarming rate here. Carl, as promised, tried to forage for food in the jungle. One morning he returned to camp with a dead monkey. "Here's our lunch," he announced, tossing the bloody carcass to the ground. That breakfast was a turning point for the entire group. When Carl returned to camp, a strange smile played across his face. In his hands he held the carcass of a small monkey. Its lifeless eyes seemed to stare at the travelers reproachfully. Blood was still oozing from the animal's head wound, leaving dark stains on the damp ground. "Here's the solution to our food problems," Carl announced, pulling out a knife. His movements were confident, almost mechanical, as if he had done this many times before. Marcus, who until that moment had been sitting silently by the fire, turned sharply pale and turned away. "I won't eat it," his voice trembled. "Not the monkey. Look at its hands, its fingers. They're like a child's." His words hung in the heavy jungle air. Yosi and Kevin glanced over. The same disgust read in their eyes, but also an understanding of dire necessity. "We're running out of rice," Kevin said quietly without raising his eyes. "If we don't find a way to get food out here in the jungle, we won't last a week." The smell of cooking meat wafted through the camp, causing conflicting feelings among the travelers. Marcus moved farther away, hiding behind the trees. He sat there for hours, munching the last crumbs of rice and ignoring the calls of the others to join in the meal. It was the first time the group was truly divided, not physically, but mentally. An invisible fissure lay between them, and it would only widen with each succeeding day. But the food problems were only the beginning. The constant humidity did its job. Marcus's feet were covered with sores and boils. Every step caused him unbearable pain, and soon he began to fall seriously behind the group. "I can't go any further," he confessed one evening when they had made camp. His legs were a horrifying sight. The skin was peeling off in layers, exposing inflamed flesh. The atmosphere in the group was getting more and more tense. Yosi and Kevin cast more and more disgruntled glances at Marcus, whose weakness was slowing their progress. Carl, on the other hand, was becoming more and more irritable. His tales of gold and lost villages now sounded like evil mockery. They had not encountered a single sign of human presence. In the evenings, sitting by a weak fire, they tried to determine their location on the map. But the dampness had turned the paper into a loose mass, and the compass seemed to have gone mad, its hand darting from side to side as if in panic. Gradually, they realized the terrible truth. They were lost in one of the most dangerous places on the planet. And then it began to rain. Not the usual short showers, but a real tropical flood that turned the jungle into a green hell. And it was then that Carl made a statement that changed the fate of the entire group forever. What started out as an adventure turned into a fight for survival. The map they trusted was useless. The constant rains had turned it into a soggy mass. The compass gave strange readings, probably due to the iron ore deposits in the mountains. They were practically blind in this green maze. Every morning began the same way, with the agonizing procedure of putting on the clothes that had been soaked overnight. Moisture was everywhere. It dripped from the leaves, seeped through the makeshift shelters, turned the soil underfoot into a treacherous mess. Marcus's boots, once good Swiss hiking boots, were now crumbling pieces of leather, full of muddy water. Food had become an obsession. The last of the rice supplies had gone moldy, and attempts at hunting became increasingly desperate. Carl spent hours tracking monkeys, but the animals seemed to taunt the hapless travelers. Their cries echoed from right and left, but it was almost impossible to see them in the dense canopy of the forest. Each evening around the campfire, the atmosphere became more and more oppressive. Kevin didn't hide his irritation at having to share a meager dinner for 4. If only someone wouldn't refuse to eat what we get. He cast oblique glances at Marcus. The man sat silent, sinking deeper into himself with each passing day. His feet, constantly wet from the humidity of the jungle, had fallen victim to trench foot, a dangerous fungal infection. The skin between his toes had softened and begun to peel away, exposing inflamed flesh. The soles of his feet developed deep cracks that bled with every step. Worst of all, the infection was not confined to the feet. Red streaks of inflammation were already rising above the ankles, portending more serious problems. In a tropical climate, even small wounds could lead to deadly infection. Yosi tossed between two worlds. His military training told him to be tougher, to make the tough decisions. But something inside him resisted it, preventing him from becoming completely calloused. He saw how Marcus was suffering, how Kevin was starving, how Carl's behavior was changing strangely. And Carl, every day there was something new in his eyes, something frightening. His stories about the gold became more and more confusing. He often contradicted himself. One night, Yosi woke up to a sound and saw Carl sitting by the fire, muttering something in German to himself. In the light of the embers, his face seemed to be a mask, frozen in a strange smile. The denouement came when they reached the confluence of the two rivers. The view before them was majestic and frightening, the dark waters of the Tuichi roaring into the narrow canyon, creating whirlpools and rapids. It was here that Carl made the statement that would split the group forever. There are only two paths beyond, and both can lead to death. San Pedro Canyon greeted them with a deafening roar of water. The Tuichi River, previously relatively calm, here turned into a raging torrent, wedged between sheer cliffs. The dark water rumbled against the sharp rocks, creating clouds of spray and dangerous whirlpools. Even from afar, it was clear that this stretch of river was not forgiving of mistakes. "You can't swim here." Carl's voice sounded unusually firm. "I've seen rapids like this before. They kill even experienced boaters." He was quiet for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, and then added what he should have said at the beginning of the trip. "Besides, I can't swim." The words fell like a stone into standing water. Kevin turned sharply toward him. "What do you mean you can't swim? You brought us here in the heart of the jungle without even knowing how to swim." It wasn't just surprise in his voice. It was pure rage. "We have two options," Carl continued, ignoring Kevin's anger. "We can walk along the Iparama River to the village, or we can try to bypass the rapids along the bank and continue rafting below the canyon." He unfolded the remnants of the map, showing the suggested routes. The group fell into a heavy silence. Everyone realized this decision could be a matter of life and death. Marcus, barely able to stand, looked at the raging river with a mixture of fear and despair. For him, rafting meant constant contact with the water, which could finally kill his injured legs. "I'll walk along the bank," Carl finally uttered. "With Marcus. He won't be able to row in this condition anyway." He turned to Yosi and Kevin. "And you can continue on the raft. I'll meet you in La Paz before Christmas." Yosi hesitated. Something about this plan seemed deeply wrong to him. Military training screamed, a group shouldn't split up in an unpredictable situation. But Kevin had already made up his mind. "The river is our only chance to get out of here quickly. We can build a new raft after the rapids." Their last minutes together were spent in a strange, oppressive atmosphere. They shared the rest of their supplies, exchanged handshakes. Marcus looked lost, as if he already had a premonition of something terrible. "I'll see you in La Paz," he said quietly. Those were the last words Yosi and Kevin heard him say. They stood on the shore, watching the two figures slowly disappear into the green gloom of the jungle. None of them knew that this parting was forever, that no one would ever see Carl and Marcus again. It didn't take long for the Tweetchee River to arrive. After an hour of travel, the raft entered the first rapids of San Pedro Canyon. The sound of the water was deafening. It roared, smashed against the rocks, creating whirlpools and countercurrents. Yosi and Kevin, clutching the makeshift oars, tried to steer the raft into the relatively calm parts of the river. "Keep to the left," Kevin shouted, spotting a particularly dangerous rapid ahead. But his voice was almost drowned out by the roar of the water. The raft raced downstream like a splinter, obeying the whim of the river rather than the commands of the rowers. Suddenly, a huge boulder rose ahead, half hidden by the foam. There was no time to maneuver. The impact was monstrous. The timbers of the raft splintered like matchsticks. Yosi saw Kevin thrown to the right bank before he was swept into the raging torrent. The world became a chaos of water, foam, and roar. He was tossed from side to side, slammed against underwater rocks. At one point he was sucked into the maelstrom, and he felt his lungs begin to burn from lack of air. By some miracle he managed to pull himself to the surface. Gasping and coughing, he saw a real nightmare ahead. A waterfall. There was no time to think. The stream was already dragging him to the edge. The last thing he did was to get more air before he was thrown down. The fall seemed endless. When he finally surfaced, there was no shore in sight. The current carried him farther and farther into the heart of the jungle. Kevin was nowhere to be seen. Only now, alone in the middle of the wilderness, did Yosi realize the true scale of the disaster. By evening he managed to get ashore, soaked, battered, but alive. His rucksack had miraculously caught on a snag near the shore. It was the only glimmer of luck on that terrible day. But it was too early to rejoice. There was a vast jungle all around, and the sun was already setting. Somewhere out there, in the green maze, maybe Kevin was there, or maybe he was no longer alive. What Yosi didn't know was that at this moment the most terrifying ordeal of his life was beginning. 19 days of fighting for survival in some of the most dangerous jungles on the planet. 19 days that would change his life forever. The first night alone was the most terrifying. Without a fire, without shelter, and soaked clothes, Yosi sat with his back against a tree, listening to the sounds of the jungle. They seemed especially ominous in the darkness. The growls of jaguars, the cries of invisible birds rustling in the bushes, every sound could mean impending death. The morning brought the first inventory of the rescued backpack. Some soggy food, a can of insect repellent, a lighter wrapped in polyethylene. It miraculously stayed dry. But the main problem was the unknown. Yosi had no idea where he was. The river had carried him so far that any landmarks were lost. At the same moment, a few kilometers upstream, Kevin was also struggling for life. The current had thrown him onto a rocky bank, severely injuring his legs. Every step caused unbearable pain, but he knew staying put meant certain death. Day by day, the situation became more and more desperate. Yosi tried to find food in the jungle, but it was more difficult than he had imagined. Most of the fruit he found was either unripe or rotten. He learned to track bird nests for eggs, but it was woefully inadequate to sustain his strength. The rains never stopped. His clothes never had time to dry, and soon Yosi's skin was covered with painful sores. He shook from the cold at night and wore himself out from the heat and humidity during the day, but worst of all were the insects. Hordes of ants, mosquitoes, and other blood-sucking creatures attacked him incessantly. On the 5th day, he discovered something terrifying in his skin. Little white flies were moving under it. The fly larvae had somehow gotten under his skin and were now eating him alive. Every movement of these parasites was painful, but there was no way to get them out. On the 7th day, Yosi experienced an encounter that could have been his last. In the pre-dawn dusk, he heard heavy breathing and saw 2 luminous dots in the bushes, the eyes of a jaguar. The predator was slowly approaching, preparing to leap. In desperation, Yosi grabbed the bug spray and a lighter, the only weapons he had. The jet of flame scared the predator away, but it was a temporary victory. On the 10th day of wandering, Kevin realized he wasn't going to make it on foot. The wounds on his legs had turned into festering sores, and every step was torture. His only chance for salvation was the river. Even though it had almost killed him a week ago, it could be his salvation now. Gathering his last strength, he found a fallen tree near the shore. It was a risky decision to trust the current without any ability to control his path, but there was no choice. Clinging to the trunk, he let the river carry him, praying that there were no new rapids ahead. Meanwhile, Yosi was sinking deeper and deeper into despair. Hunger and loneliness were doing their work. His consciousness began to play tricks on him. On the 13th day, he saw her for the first time, a young girl sitting next to him at the improvised shelter. She didn't say a word. She was just there, but her presence was strangely empowering. "I knew it was a hallucination," Yosi later recalled. "But I talked to her, shared meals with her, built her a shelter from the rain. When she disappeared one morning, I felt such despair, as if I had lost my last friend on Earth." On the 5th day of his lonely rafting trip, Kevin heard voices. At first he thought he was hallucinating, but the voices became clearer and clearer. On the opposite bank, he saw 2 Indians with guns. Gathering his last strength, he shouted in Spanish, "Ayúdame." The Indians were from the village of San Jose, the same village they had been searching for so long. They pulled Kevin out of the river and brought him to the village, but rescuing one man meant beginning the search for another. As soon as Kevin recovered a little, he immediately went to La Paz to organize a search operation, and Yosi was still out there in the green hell of the Amazon. He didn't know help was on the way. He didn't know that Kevin had survived. He didn't know that fate was preparing his final, most severe test before presenting him with salvation. On the 17th day of solitary survival, Yosi heard the sound of an engine. The plane of the search team flew right over his head, but the thick canopy of the jungle safely hid him from the eyes of the rescuers. That moment was the most terrifying of the days of the ordeal. When the plane left, I collapsed in the dirt and burst into tears, Yosi later recalled. For the first time ever, I truly wanted to die. In La Paz, meanwhile, a real drama unfolded. Kevin, barely recovered from his wounds, flitted between consulates, begging for help. At the Israeli consulate, he was promised support. But when he turned to the Austrian consulate to ask for help finding Karl, he was in for a shock. "Karl Ruprechter?" the consul interrogated. "This man is wanted by Interpol. He is not a geologist. He's a criminal." But all these events remained unknown to Yosi. He continued to wade along the river, no longer hoping for rescue. His legs were bleeding wounds, His body was covered with insect bites and blisters. He slept very little for fear of predators and ate whatever he could find, mostly snails and bird eggs. On the 19th day, what would later be called a miracle occurred. Tico Tudela, a local guide hired for the search, steered his boat into a small channel, a place that wasn't even in the search area. "Something told me to turn there," he recounted later. On the shore, unconscious, lay a man who looked more like a corpse. It was Yosi. When he opened his eyes in the boat, the first person he saw was Kevin. "I thought it was another hallucination," Yosi later admitted. "But when Kevin put his arms around me, I realized it was real. I survived." It took Yosi 3 months in the hospital to return to life, but even after his physical recovery, he was no longer the same person. "The jungle changed me forever," he said. "They taught me to appreciate simple things. A sip of clean water, dry clothes, human warmth." Carl and Marcus were never found. Despite many search operations, the jungle kept the mystery alive. Perhaps they died of starvation or disease. Perhaps they were overtaken by one of the many dangers of the Amazon. They have become part of the dark legend of these places, a reminder of how dangerous it is to underestimate the power of the wild. 10 years later, Yosi returned to these places, but with a different purpose. Together with locals, he created the Chalalan Ecological Lodge, which has become a symbol of peaceful coexistence between humans and the jungle. "The Amazon tried to kill me," he says, "but in the end, it taught me how to live." The story has become a legend, a reminder that the human spirit can overcome any adversity. But it also remains a warning to anyone who risks challenging the wilderness without being prepared. Because the jungle doesn't forgive mistakes or give second chances, and somewhere in their verdant depths still holds the mystery of the disappearance of 2 men who went in search of ghostly gold. Yosi Ginsberg's story makes you think about a lot of things. About how thin the line between adventure and tragedy is. About how vulnerable we humans of the modern world are in the face of wildlife. And, of course, how important it is to be attentive to the warning signals that fate sends us. What made 4 young people trust a stranger and embark on a deadly journey? Was it just youthful arrogance or something more? The eternal human desire to look beyond the horizon, to go a little farther than others? And could the tragedy have been avoided if they had heeded the warnings of the locals? And what would you have done in Yosi's shoes when the group decided to split up? Would you have followed your barely known friend Kevin, or would you have chosen the safer, as it seemed at the time, route with Carl and Marcus? Write your thoughts in the comments. I'm very interested to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There will be many more amazing stories about people who defied the elements and managed to survive in the most unbelievable circumstances. In the meantime, take care of yourself and remember, sometimes the greatest adventure is just staying alive. See you in the next issues.